It's getting ready. And we are live, Ryan Brown.
Yeah. Hello.
Hello. It's so good to have you here. I, first of all, wanted to congratulate you on this, Dear Coffee Buyer.
Thank you. Thank
This
you.
book, I was reading it frantically over the last week because I'm doing a fuck ton of things at the moment. But I got to tell you, this was one of the best coffee books I've read, and easily the easiest coffee book I've read. Congratulations. It's beautiful, it's well written, and it's engaging.
Thank you so much. It is meant to be frantically read, so I'm glad that that's the way you were reading it.
Yeah. Tell me how it happened, how the book came about. Then we'll talk about your career later. But how did the book come about?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me to talk with you. Yeah, likewise. So how did the book come to be? Yeah, probably starting 5 or 6 years ago, Scott-Rao started reaching out to me as he does and saying things. Scott will often email me, "Hey, I've got an interesting job opportunity for you. Hey, I know a person who I really feel like always trying to get me to do to sort of like jump into coffee things." And he also said, "I really think that there's an opportunity for someone to write a coffee book about coffee buying." And while I was a coffee buyer, that for whatever reason, that didn't seem appealing. And even when I was done coffee buying, but still working in coffee, more on the tech side of things, for whatever reason, that didn't seem appealing. And then about 3 months after I formally left the coffee industry, he said it again. And for some reason that time it was like, ding, yeah, let's do that. Let's write that book now. And for me, it was really a matter of, as I feel like I've left coffee, and I feel like it's also inevitable that I will return. There's something about walking out the door and feeling like I could give back to something that had employed me for honestly 17 years.
Yeah, wow. By the way, your email's about to blow up now that you just said that.
Oh, shoot.
Announced here on the Mapper Forward podcast, Ryan Brown returns to the coffee industry-ish.
Possibly. Or best offer.
The offers, you should put the offer dollar amount in the subject for anyone who is.
Yes.
That's how we'll be sorting them out.
Serious offers only.
Correct. Must be vetted by Scott-Rao. Let me tell you, that's how that's going to go.
Yeah.
So he will always want first dibs. He will always want first dibs on you as a green buyer. He's told me before. Yeah.
So and then honestly, I sat down one day, and if you ever want to write a book, I first off, do not take any advice about writing a fiction book from me or maybe from anyone. And this is probably like, if you have ever just Googled like, how do I write a book? I'm sure that this is in there. So I'm not opening eyes to anyone, but if you can sit down and write a list of the questions that you would want answered in such a book, and then create some sort of outline, it's amazing how fast you can do that. And I think I did that in about 10 minutes, maybe less. And once I did that, I was kind of off to the races.
That's interesting that you say that, because I felt like that going through the book. I thought, I've always wondered about that, and I've always wondered about that and wondered about that. And I thought, this guy's just answering so much of the questions that I've had, but was always too embarrassed to ask somebody about. You answer this simple stuff, but you also address the more complex things as well. So well done.
Yeah, I think you've reached your compliment.
This is not me complimenting. I don't piss in people's pockets. Just know that.
I'm honestly not familiar with that expression. So
okay, that's an Australian term. I think here they say like blokes smoke up somebody's ass or something like that. But that could be an Australianism as well. But when in Australia we say I'm pissing in your pocket is when like you're placating someone or you're, So no, I know it's very Australian. No, I'm not someone who pisses in people's pockets. I was genuinely impressed with this book because I didn't feel like an idiot reading it, which is always nice, right? Like this is something that has nothing, this book talks about something that I know nothing about. And I managed to get to the end of it, understanding it and not feeling like a moron. And I find a lot of coffee books leave you feeling like you don't know very much. You feel stupid at reading a lot of coffee books. I do anyway. And I have a science degree. I shouldn't get to the end of a coffee book feeling like an idiot. This book, I felt, and I know that, look, this is not a compliment. This is something that I just want to say to anyone who's listening to this. And I said this to Scott yesterday. Every coffee professional should own this book for one specific reason. And it's a thing that I really loved that you did at the beginning of it. You teach people how to communicate. It doesn't matter whether they're green buying. It doesn't matter who the fuck they're talking to. If you are a coffee professional, read this book just so that you can learn how to communicate like a professional. It's,
it's just soft skills, right? They've maybe coming back into fashion, but it was really surprising to me how often I would be talking with suppliers at various levels, importers, exporters, coffee farmers, and they would tell me, I'm not gonna drop here because it would be not complimentary. I've been trying to work with so-and-so, but they are not emailing me back. I haven't heard from them. They came, they visited, it seemed really great. And I just haven't heard anything. And
which is rude, right? As well as being unprofessional, it's rude.
It's rude. It's unprofessional. I want to make the very self-serving argument for anyone who is potentially erring here that it's also just, I swooped up, didn't steal. I was able to get coffee that I wouldn't have otherwise gotten because of other people's inability to communicate properly. Because I discussed this in the book, but imagine you're a coffee farmer or an importer and exporter, but as a coffee farmer, you work many months a year. You don't know, you sort of you're putting all your eggs in a future payment basket. And then to have someone not really communicating clearly about their commitments it's unsettling, and you will end up finding someone who can communicate more clearly, someone who can communicate more consistently. You'll go with that sure bet. And so I was able to get into some really great relationships with people and double down on those relationships as a consequence of just mistakes on the part of other coffee buyers.
Because the barrier to entry is so low for coffee, I think that we unfortunately end up missing a couple of steps for the people who enter our industry, like teaching people how to be professional and how to respond to emails and how to resign and, how to not turn up to work. And
wait, that was a very specific one. Did you have a problem with someone resigning?
It shocks me how many people resign via text message or just stop showing up to work. That would never be acceptable in the corporate world or in most other professionals, but it is in our industry for some reason. It's expected. And I feel that, and that was the thing that I loved reading the beginning of this book, because that's what Map It Forward's about. That's kind of why the business was formed, because there was such a need and people were asking us for it. Can you teach us professionalism? Oh shit, there really isn't anyone that's talking about professionalism in our industry. And when you started talking about it, that's what really sucked me into the book. I'm this is addressing so much more than just green bean buying. This is a well-rounded approach for coffee professionals. And so I was thinking we need to put together a list of, for people that are entering the coffee industry, what are the must reads? And this is going to go on the list. So
that's very generous. It's funny. I wouldn't normally, the idea of me being an expert on professionalism is amusing to me. I think the key is there's just a few things that really make sense with regards to how you communicate with people both inside your company and then especially people who are on the outside who are not seeing what's going on a daily basis. And they are more professional, and then also they will save you a bunch of times if you if you're just like a little bit smart about it.
Yeah, we often say like do business with good people. Like
Yeah.
It makes doing business so much easier, and people will always want to do business with you if you're good at doing business with them. It's a no-brainer. So again, thanks for pushing that agenda, because we need to have more people that are pushing that agenda right now, because again, like I said, the barrier to entry is so low. We need to start having that conversation.
I had to put that chapter in also because I used to joke for years that someday I would write. This was before I was serious about it. I used to joke like someday I'm going to write a book on being a coffee buyer, and it's just going to be one sentence, and I think it was something like, and it's going to say, answer your emails. Yeah, just like,
I would put another one in there. Respond to meeting invitations. Like, fuck, that drives me crazy.
Oh, funny.
It's like
I break that rule sometimes, but not. You know what? It depends. At my most recent corporate-ish gig, it was basically assumed that as long as it would show up on your calendar that everyone could see if you were just invited. And so I would sometimes say no, like, no, I cannot come to this. And otherwise I just assumed like they could expect me. There's also the element of surprise, Lee. Like if there's,
I know, clearly, like I'm not a girl who likes surprise. I know. Is Ryan going to show up to the podcast? That could be an exciting thing. It would
did reply to this.
You did.
Everybody, Lee invited me to this podcast time using Google Calendars.
And he responded. So choose that. What are you drinking?
I am drinking. I was in San Francisco last week, and the coffee buyer there, whose last name I don't remember, but his first name is Jose. Mm-hmm. He used to be the trainer there, and he's great. And he gave me a bag of coffee, and I don't remember what it is. I remember that it's from Guatemala, and I don't remember anything else about the coffee.
You taught me something very important that I'd never thought about before when I was...
I took the rules of which I just totally broke.
Correct, but...
I'm not selling the coffee though, so I feel okay.
That's why it's okay. It's something that in the last 24 hours, I've been thinking about it a lot since I read about it. It's this idea of the way that we represent a coffee, if we're responsible for selling it. And that's at any stage, right? Like as a barista or as a business owner that's selling elixir to my wholesalers and representing a coffee, whatever it is. I have always been, and this is, I guess to put it in context, in the Australian industry over the last 15 years, it's always been one of those things where whenever somebody asks us, oh, what kind of a coffee is this? We would either name the blend, it's roasted by these guys and that's the name of the blend. Or if it's a single origin, we'd just say, oh, it's a single origin roasted by this place from this country.
Yeah.
And you talk about this really eloquently in the book about the idea that we have a responsibility to tell the story of the coffee. And I thought that was beautiful, dude. As a songwriter, I loved the idea that we can do that well without ramming this shit down our customers' throats. And that for me has always been the difficult part of how we do that to people who just want their cappuccino with 2 sugars and want to go to work.
Yep.
And I realized that, go ahead.
I guess the thing I would want to add to that is, I think that's something that potentially plagues the coffee industry, at least, and this comes maybe more from an internal perspective than an external perspective, is that we all seemed to do things the same way. And then anytime anyone did something differently, there is a push to either normalize them, follow them, or explain why what they're doing is wrong. And it's an interesting thing. I think it in some ways it shows that coffee is still in its nascency. And I don't say that in a negative way. I'm actually saying, like, imagine how much coffee can grow up. And like, I'm excited about all of the ways in which coffee can grow up, but it still reflects that we're still at this place where we all kind of feel in the industry kinship with one another. And so we feel like there should be certain values that we all agree on. And of course there are, but we've probably overextended what those values are. So while I did that at Ritual, while it was important for me at Ritual to say, well, that's ridiculous. Like, you don't walk into a restaurant and say, I'll have your finest French wine, or look at the menu and like look up and say like, I'll have the Argentina. That despite that, I think that there's a lot of opportunities in coffee to market differently. So, and I think that one thing I expect to see, I'm reminded of Cho Chocolate, who, I don't know what Cho's status is as a chocolatier anymore, but back in the day, they had an interesting approach, which was that they had like 3 or 4 different flavors of chocolate, and their sourcing corresponded somewhat, but there was also blend possibilities, but they were branding their chocolate as like fruity, nutty, citrusy, and I think chocolatey. And I think they were like working on their floral, but that was harder for them than they expected. But like I haven't really seen someone do that in a deep way in coffee. I've seen things that have started to get close to it. I'm trying to remember which ones, but there's been a few people who've kind of like dabbled in that. And I want to say like outright, I think it's okay if you're like, we just don't talk about where the coffee comes from. That's like, because the way that we're telling the story is X, Y, or Z. I think if you don't know where to get started in how you tell the story of your coffee, the easiest way to just do something is to talk about the coffee producer. And I think that's a bare minimum if you don't know how you should talk about coffee. So that I'm not trying to walk back what I said in the book, more just there's a variety of approaches to talking about coffee. And I think that we've barely scratched the surface on what those are.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think that the interesting thing is I don't know that anyone's found the way that's actually going to work yet, if that makes any sense. I think we're all trying, but the thing that the placeholder way of doing it is we'll just talk about origin and we'll talk about kind of the region, but that's about it, because that's sort of what's working now. And maybe we'll tell them if it's natural or washed.
Jesus. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, that seems to be
you just hit a sore spot.
I know. By the way, I'm going to hit an even sorer spot. I like African naturals.
There's nothing wrong. No, there's no. I also feel deeply misunderstood on this.
No, I say that because at some point Scott's going to see this, and he and I constantly butt heads on that. At one time he said to me, Africa, Ryan even doesn't like, he says naturals aren't that great either. So he and I have this constant thing of like, let's have a natural.
Are we jumping out of order now if we talk about naturals?
No, go for it. It's a conversation. We'll probably jump in a million different directions. It's fine.
I mean, the thing you just said that hit me in the gut a little bit was like, we may or may not tell you that it's a natural or a washed. That I can't like, so I unfortunately, I just like, I would say that 99% of the naturals that I drink are bad. And I'm saying like from third wave coffee shops. Mm-hmm. Some percentage of the washed coffees I have are, I would say, objectively bad, but it's much lower than that. I also like, I've become so bummed out by what the state of naturals are. So I think naturals can be exceptional coffees, and especially when they are processed in arid regions where the coffee can dry quickly on its own.
That was really enlightening when I read that. I'm like, okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So Yemen, Ethiopia, Harar, and like there's even a ton from the Cerrado region of Brazil that are just like, yeah, this makes sense to me. This is like it's got a lot of fruit, but it's not this sickening like
minty.
Yeah, my description was always like some combination of a like overripe banana, a like sour strawberry, and like slightly stale peanut butter. Like that's how I describe what I taste in a lot of naturals. but and then just like the status, for some reason, I remember back in my day, if you were selling a natural, you said that on the bag prominently. And that is now no longer in fashion, which
I don't understand.
Caused me a lot of heartache too.
It's such an important part of the story for one, but it's an important piece of information for anyone who knows what the fuck they're drinking.
Yeah.
Like it's.
And yeah. And then I don't know what training looks like at coffee shops these days. I'm not proud of this. I want to start by saying I'm not proud of this, but I usually have the following conversation at a coffee shop. Hi, what do you got? And they'll usually tell me. And if it's something like, if it's an origin like Kenya or Colombia, I can pretty much just end the conversation there. But if it's an origin like anything in Central America, increasingly, I mean, like Ethiopia naturals, just like there's so few Harars in the United States anymore because they all go to the Middle East now. But so like most Ethiopias, I then have to say like, oh, is it a washed or a natural? And I hate doing this because I feel like it's drawing attention to like,
the
oh,
fact that you know what you're talking about. Yeah,
this smart ass like
person. Yeah, right. I hate being that person. But
so
you want to have a good coffee. Like you want the best chance at, if you're going to go to the trouble of ordering a coffee, you want to have the best chance at enjoying it, right?
Yeah. And I want to know, like, should I get an Americano? Which I don't really prefer Americanos, but I prefer them to most naturals. So
how do you drink coffee typically in a cafe?
I will usually get whatever they have. Yeah, I'll get drip. Yeah.
Just a coffee. Sorry. I'm still not used to saying coffee and meaning everything.
Right. Yeah.
So in Australia, it's an espresso. It's mostly espresso based. Sure. But you'll typically go in and just have a coffee?
Yeah. I will seldom get anything else. At this point, I feel like I know what I like, and it's drip coffee. So,
did you deliberately get into coffee, or was it an accident?
I deliberately got into coffee, but my intentions were much different than working in it for 17 years. So, like, I didn't think like, oh, this could be an interesting couple of decades. I
don't think any of us did really.
No. I was fresh out of high school, and I wanted a job that I would have for 6 to 12 months. And this seems super strange to me now, but I had expectations that I would be traveling a lot in Europe. And I was like, here's like, if I know how to make espresso beverages, I could hypothetically go to Europe and like live somewhere for a while and like be able to get some sort of job where I could, be helpful. It also seemed like something convenient to do on the side of college. And my first coffee job was at a Pete's Coffee that was about 2 blocks from the house that I grew up in. Mm-hmm. And Pete's was awesome in that, one, on your first day, you did a cupping.
Oh, cool.
They cared a ton about tasting and cupping. We did that with tea as well. Even though I rarely drink tea, I essentially believe that tea is a superior beverage. Sorry.
I am an avid tea drinker. So
yeah.
I'm with you on that one.
Surprisingly, I don't drink it, but I think it's a superior beverage. And just like had a great opportunity to see the roasting up close. Got to talk to they had a huge bean counter area, and essentially at Pete's you'd start at the bean counter, then you would graduate to the coffee bar, and then if you really worked there long enough, you graduated back to the bean counter, as what they called it. And it was because that was where you could do like you could make the most damage essentially on selling the most amount of like equipment and beans, and just like it was the bigger price point things. so the mechanics of it were the easiest compared with the espresso bar, but and like also just like the timing of the coffee bars was crazy, because we'd be steaming these like gigantic pitchers of milk. But yeah, it was like, I really fell in love when I went back to the bean counter. I fell in love with just like talking to people about what the coffees were. And I learned this thing really early on, which was if a customer sees you talking to another customer in great detail about whatever question they have, they'll come to you and they'll start unloading all these questions on you that they were holding back because they didn't want to, because the default also is if you don't know the answer, you don't just say like, oh, I don't know. You say like, well, you're stupid for asking me that, because that makes you. I didn't actually ever say that verbatim,
I'm
but
so glad.
Get the fuck out of here!
Yeah, right?
Why don't you go to Starbucks?
Yeah, they'll know the answer.
Yeah.
Don't go to the third wave shops. The baristas there don't know fucking anything. They'll pretend they do, but oops.
Met amazing people at Pete's as well. The two who really stand out as people who had a huge influence on my appreciation for tasting coffee. And that was the thing too, is that I went in with the idea of working there for 6 to 12 months. Then I did a cupping with Rich Avella, and I did a cupping with Paul Rader. Rich Avella is in the Bay Area coffee community.
Okay.
He owns a coffee company, I think Highwire. And then Paul Rader is a roaster for Caribou these days. And those two just like sent me on a different trajectory of like really, and because their jobs, they were tasting trainers, which was like the most amazing title ever. They would just go around to the cafe. I'm romanticizing their job and probably also minimizing what they were actually doing, but they would just like go around to the cafes and set up cuppings and taste coffee with people. And that was, to me, the coolest thing ever. So
what was that like when you cupped it? When you cupped coffee for the first time, did like something switch in you and was like, I'm into this. Like I need to do more of this for a long time. Did you know then?
Yeah. Yeah, because they would go through, and it's gonna be a little bit embarrassing what I think thing that clicked for me was, but they would set up these cuppings, and Pete's was primarily blends, and even the single origins were country names, and they were typically blends of those countries. Back then, at least. This was in 1999, and I remember one coffee in particular was this blend called Garuda, which was a blend of Indonesian and probably New Guinean coffees, and maybe also we had one called. Yeah, that was the main one. And essentially they were like, this one is earthier. It was probably something like this. This is an earthier blend. And it was like, oh my God, yes, it does taste like dirt. And
they were saying earthier as a compliment.
Oh yeah, and I loved it too. I was like, yeah. And it's partially, and I've experienced this since, I remember with a lot of the Ethiopian naturals in the like mid 2000s, that just for the first time, someone describing flavors and then you tasting those flavors, it's really a huge deal. And so yeah, I would say that was a big turning moment for me. And then after that, my good friend Drew Catlin, who works for Stumptown, he and I grew up together down the street from each other, and he started working at Pete's too. And he and I would show up every night at closing and just cup coffee or tea. And it was ridiculous. I'm also not sure if that was entirely legal within like our employment contract, but we would just we would show up every night and just cup. And during the day we would cup whenever we could.
I wanted to ask you, I have a theory that given the barrier to entry is so low in coffee, we tend to attract certain kinds of people. And I feel that people who decide to stay, it's because they find a sense of belonging somehow. And I wonder if that moment when you were, and I might be completely off here, but that moment when somebody described that flavor profile to you and you resonated with that, did you feel a sense of belonging? Did you feel like it was one of those things of, oh, I get this, maybe this is where I belong?
You know, possibly. It's also, and this might be two sides of the same coin.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible that it was the opposite of that, right? That it was,
Okay.
I'm on the outside of this thing. I really want to be on the inside of this thing. And I think what impressed me the most about Paul and Rich was how much they knew and how excited they were about it. This thing that I had not, I had seen coffee as like, yeah, it's these kind of disgustingly dark brown beans, and at Pete's they were nearly black, and and just like, who, like, this isn't that interesting. Like, I don't know why you need 40 different versions of this. But when they would describe them and describe the stories behind each one of them, I just had a huge, I had a lot of envy and aspiration to be a person who could talk about those things in that way.
How was that? Where did you think you were going to go after that with regards to your career? I know you were thinking of you going to Europe, but did you study computer engineering? Was that what you studied? What did you study? Was it more romantic? You did a PhD in poetry or something?
No, let's see. At the end of high school, I probably thought I was an English literature major, but I don't even know if I was at that point. I think I was interested in potentially studying law at some point.
Oh, okay.
I think that may have also been motivated by like a girl at the time, a girlfriend.
Or a TV show. It always is either a TV show or a girl or something.
It was a girlfriend. Yeah. I know for sure.
And
because her dad was a lawyer. So.
Oh, okay. You would have a better in with her if you were going to impress her by, hey, the things, the primal way, right?
Her dad also, you're like reminding me of stuff I've forgotten about, but
you're welcome.
Definitely made fun of me for working in coffee.
Did they?
He did, yeah.
Yeah, my dad did the same thing. I have a genetics degree, and went into the corporate world and became a project manager and senior business analyst for IBM, and then just one day decided to quit and go into the coffee industry. And my father was mortified. He used to tell, I was in magazines and stuff for being a barista. My father used to, in such a sarcastic, condescending way, would go around and say to people, my daughter's the most famous fucking waitress in Australia.
Good.
Fuck you too.
That's good.
Yeah, my daughter's the most famous waitress in Australia. And I would say to him, this is going to pay off one day. Like I just need to do what I'm passionate about. That wasn't important in our culture. Like, who do you think you are to do what you're passionate about? Go out there and make yourself a career. The corporate world didn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I have to give my parents credit. They never seemed to have any issue with me. I mean, like, I want to start by saying too, the coffee industry has evolved a lot, and I think that perceptions of the coffee, maybe this is again like potentially an internal perspective, but I feel like the sort of the way that people see someone who becomes a barista or working in coffee generally is much different now than it was 10 years ago, and is much different than it was 10 years before that.
100%. It's a legitimate career in Australia. You can make a very good living. The average price a barista is paid in Sydney, Australia. I looked this up the other day with Jeff Dillon, the coffee accountant. The average price a barista is paid in Sydney, Australia is $29.33 per hour.
Damn. That's great.
Yeah. I was, for pretty much the last 6 years of my career as a barista, was working 4 days a week in a cafe and living in one of the most expensive parts of Sydney, and able to pay my rent and expenses, et cetera, et cetera. It's pretty good.
That probably 10 years ago in San Francisco, you could still do that. And San Francisco is not nothing, but that was also one of the like low points of technology in that city. And in the time since then, as I've talked to cafe and roastery owners in San Francisco, they tell me, yeah, none of the, like, no one lives in San Francisco anymore. They all are commuting from Oakland.
Yeah, wow.
So I remember Ritual, when we opened, we had, well, not when we opened, but let's say like a year in, when we had, you know, between, let's say like 15 employees. Most were living in San Francisco. Maybe one or two lived in Oakland. And these, I mean, like, I think for the past many years now, it's not been even close to that.
Yeah, we're trying to work on a plan to help baristas get their wages up to $20 an hour. And that's going to, we're not trying to work on it, we are working on it. And the idea is that there's this whole chicken and egg thing that exists. You've got baristas that are like, I don't want to work harder because I get paid minimum wage. And then there's employers that are like, I don't want to pay them anymore because they're not working hard enough. So I've decided to break that cycle, and I'm working with some baristas at the moment, and any other barista that wants to get on this program as well. We want to teach each barista to work at the rate of 2, so that going from wherever they are now to $20 an hour makes sense to an employer.
Yeah.
We teach people how to sell, teach them about customer service and beverage preparation and all of that kind of stuff, so that if you are much more efficient and you're making more money for the business that you're working for, it's a no-brainer to pay you $20 an hour, because you're making way more than that for your employer every hour. But it's a conscious effort to do that. There's definitely a shift that needs to happen. Uber and Lyft have done a great thing for our industry. Uber and Lyft are the new role that what the barista used to be for people. You know, people used to, it used to be the placeholder job. And now people are people are figuring out that, fuck this, why do I have to go and stand in a cafe for minimum wage? I can go drive Uber or Lyft and set my own hours, make better than minimum wage, and still study if I want to on the side, or work on my entrepreneurial endeavors. And so there's a mass exodus out of coffee around the country. And what we're left with is all this talent that actually wants to be a career coffee professional. We have to make sure that when they're ready to go have babies, that they don't just leave.
Yeah. The other, I mean, the big thing about whenever I talk with Uber and Lyft drivers, they always say they love the job for the flexibility. And that makes me think, like, what is it that baristas say that they love? And it's usually they're really buying into a vision, which can be a good thing and a powerful thing. And it can also be, I've seen it be a detrimental thing as well. I mean, I think a lot of the kind of like, you know, like we don't do iced espresso, that kind of stuff comes from this, we have bought into a purpose that we have decided is actually more important than serving the customer.
You talk about decaf in that way as well. I loved that.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I'm a big advocate for decaf. I was when I was a barista as well. Like, there are some people that drink decaf because of medical reasons. Why should they be penalized?
Yeah.
Because of that, shouldn't we be treating them with as much respect as a customer as everybody else that we pay attention to?
Yeah. And Tony Tonks, he kind of even went further and said that if they are drinking coffee purely for the flavor of the coffee and not even for the caffeine, like,
respect.
That's even
right?
That's even more. So certainly on average, you have to assume that a decaf person likes coffee more than a normal coffee drinker.
It's an easy way to win a customer for life. Like, when you've shown a decaf drinker that you give many, many fucks about the quality of their coffee, they're never going anywhere else, because most other places give 0 fucks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about something that's very controversial in the coffee industry right now.
Let's get into it.
And it makes me like look at the heavens every time I see a fucking post about it. Geisha versus Geisha.
Oh no, I knew you were going to ask me this.
And I was reading it in your book last night, and I'm like, I really like that Ryan said that, because I have always said Geisha, right?
I said this before. I said
Yes.
this before the controversy.
Yeah, you did. And as I read it, I'm like, oh shit, I've got to get a snapshot of this and put it up on Instagram so that people can actually stop taking a social justice warrior position on this. And like, I don't know that anyone really understands where the origin comes from, do they?
There are mixed stories.
But there's no definitive one, right?
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
good. Carry on. Tell the story.
Yeah, let me say this. If we're talking about the difference, I've read the posts. I understand. I understand the argument against Geisha. In my time as a coffee buyer, I have waffled on this myself. And so I have, I was in an early group of people back in the, mid 2000s who were calling it Geisha. And then as I did some more homework, I realized that that was potentially a misleading way to ascribe this coffee. I never could imagine associating geisha with the other type of geisha.
No, I was shocked when people started saying it. I'm like, I didn't even think about it that way.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And if that is happening, if that's happening at all, that's awful. And if it's happening a lot, then yeah, we should probably consider rebranding this coffee. I want to make the case that Geisha does not go far enough to rebrand it if people are associating geisha with geishas. So why don't we just drop Geisha as well and acknowledge, one, we don't actually know that this comes from the Geisha part of Ethiopia.
How did that start though? Like at what point did it had to have originated from somewhere, this Geisha word? Do we know?
Yeah. So the story that has been passed on to me is that when this coffee was in this Costa Rican variety plot, essentially, they knew that it had come from Ethiopia. They looked at a map and they picked Geisha. Like they saw that and they picked that. I want to be super clear. Like I don't actually want to be spreading the story as like, hey kids, this is what happened. Because I don't know that.
Okay. But that was the story that was passed down to you.
This is the story that was passed down to me, and I will do my part in spreading this disinformation.
Okay, excellent. Well done.
And so it's potentially erroneous that it comes from the Geisha part of Ethiopia at all or anywhere near it. So let's just say that. But I want to focus in on this thing of deciding to call it Geisha instead of geisha. I don't really think that solves the ethical problem of associations with geisha. I think that people could still decide to use really shitty imagery to advertise the coffee as with imagery from potentially Japanese inspired or geisha inspired imagery that would be offensive. So,
and I think that's the core of the problem, right? It's the people who are choosing to take it in an inappropriate direction and culturally misappropriate where it's not called for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I don't want this to sound like I'm just shrugging my shoulders and saying, let's move on. I'm actually like, I would actually, if I was in coffee, I would, at this point, selling geisha coffee, I would strongly consider using that power. And roasters, this is the amazing thing, is that there are no regulations around how you advertise there's almost no regulations. It's just all these like expectations from your peers who are competing with you. You can do whatever you want. If you want to start calling geisha or geisha by a completely different name to get it as far away from that association as possible,
It's
you
the
have
new
the power
blossom
to do that.
varietal. You could call it anything.
Yeah. I
And
thought you said the new possum, and I was like, possum might not be the great. That's not.
No, blossom. Blossom.
Blossom's good. Blossom's good.
But you're right. You know, that leads to a whole other thing of we don't have any real standards when it comes to this shit in an industry that's the second most traded commodity in the world. That's outrageous, isn't it? It's go ahead. What were you going to say?
Because we're all self-policing each other on this stuff.
How do we change that, Ryan? Like in
change the self-policing?
Well, who's going to be responsible for something like this? There's so much that needs to have, this is the list we're going to go by. This is the list of definitions. You know, we need a definition about what the fuck. I've stopped using the word direct trade because it means so many different things now.
Yeah. This might surprise you. I would prefer less self-policing. I would prefer, and this is what I'm saying. I'm saying, and to me, this is proof of our, like, at least specialty or third wave coffee's nascency, is that we are doing this self-policing. You're not really seeing nearly as much of that in more mature industries. There's definitely, I mean, because there's a ton of that potentially in wine. But I think there's an opportunity for someone to say, you know what, Geisha is offensive. Geisha is still offensive. Let's call it something else. Let's decide what we're going to call this variety, and let's just start calling it that. And that might not support the person walking in from one to another, but as long as they can trace the lineage back to, yeah, this was the thing formerly known as Geisha.
It's now blossom.
I'm potentially opening a can of worms right here, which is part of the fun thing about not working in coffee anymore. So.
Right, but here's the great thing about why I wanted to have this podcast, is so that we could have conversations that spark ideas and make people go off after they've listened to this of, well, maybe we should do that thing that Ryan talked about on the podcast, because it's important. We need to start talking about these standards. I would like for there to be a list of standards that existed somewhere. However, I start thinking about that, and then of course you come to the usual questions that come around, like when you think of things like regulation, is who is going to make those decisions, and how do we find the right people to make those decisions?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it's like, I'm okay, we could self-police.
We have some of those things. Like, we already have some things like what I'm describing. That if half the industry started calling it Blossom, and the other half of the industry started calling it Super Cool, we kind of already have that in a way, which is that a huge part of, let's say, the world. So, I mean, like, if you get a coffee that is pulped and then goes through some amount of direct drying with mucilage intact, and you're in Brazil, you're calling that a pulp natural. But if you do the same process in Central America, ta-da, it's a honey coffee. And this was largely because Central America has always perceived its coffee to be of a superior quality to Brazil in the cup. And
so they wanted to separate themselves out from Brazil that way?
Yes. Okay. But it's at least within there's of course ranges to all of these processes, but there's like nothing that is definitively different about pulp natural from honey. And there's of course pulp natural on one farm in Brazil and another farm in Brazil, and honey on one farm in Costa Rica and another farm in Costa Rica. Like, those can mean wildly different things within those two definitions, but they're the same. Those two processes are the same.
Are there? I've never been to Origin. I think after all the podcasts I've been doing with coffee growers, I've already had an influx of invitations. I'm hopefully going to Oaxaca early next year for the next harvest, which nice. I'm super excited about. I don't know if you know Enrique Lopez, but he was on the podcast, and his coffee, he's doing some really cool stuff. You'd love him. He's nice. He's ex corporate, and he's been in the coffee industry about 20 years. And
Okay.
he's one of these people who's obsessed with smelling everything. He smells leaves, he smells coffee, he smells the ground, he smells everything. He's awesome.
Yeah.
And his coffee is so sought after that his solution to that wasn't, I'm going to buy more land. His solution to that was, I'm going to help the coffee farms around me produce coffee as good as me,
Yeah.
especially the women. And so that way the whole of Oaxaca wins. I'm like, this guy's awesome.
Yeah. 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 That's great. I've known several people who have basically grown in the same way as that, including one of my best supplier friends, Alejandro Valiente, who was in El Salvador, the tip of El Salvador, the north, like kind of the north tip of El Salvador that's on the border of Honduras, and he had started working, like essentially helping the like surrounding community process their coffee and find markets for their coffee.
With that shifting going on and those kinds of things becoming more appealing to specialty, I guess, the specialty market, excuse me, and what's going on with the C market, which I don't really understand as much as I would like to understand it, because embarrassingly, I've only started to really get my head around what the C market meant in the last few months.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mind admitting that I don't know that, because I hope it will encourage other people to admit that they don't know what the fuck is going on, and that we are heading into some very interesting and uncertain and pretty scary times for coffee producers around the world. What do you think is going to happen in the next 12 months?
Oh God, you're gonna have to. What's going to go on with what in the next 12 months?
So with regards to the C market versus specialty, do you think that the C market is going to crash and the specialty market is going to be inundated with people trying to relationship buy, if I could borrow that word from your book, and from John from Onyx uses that word as well, Onyx Coffee Lab? Do you think that's something? I mean, you might not know, you might not have any opinion, whatever, but what do you think? It's an interesting time, at least. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I think the C market is probably the way that coffee will continue to be traded for a long time. It has never really perfectly served specialty coffee. It's, we can't entirely ignore it. It's a lot easier to say we'll ignore it when it's really, really low. And by we, I mean us smaller roasters or buyers. Mm-hmm. But even when, especially when it goes really high, it is nearly impossible for us to ignore, because I have been at a roaster where we had relationships falling apart because the C market was so high. Because it was essentially a place where, between the C market and then differentials paid to those countries, that we had contracts that were priced under where coffee could be sold separately. So I think you can pretty much guarantee that the price will go up from what I most recently saw it at. I have the benefit of not looking at it on a daily basis anymore.
Does that feel good?
Yeah, I mean, it's also been long enough that I've forgotten that it's a luxury that I have now. But I did see that I've seen recently that it's quite low. Commodities are. Yeah. I mean, commodities, like I remember in high school when we were learning about the stock market, someone asked about trading commodities, and that this grumpy teacher said something like, trading like commodities is like better off going to Vegas or something like that. So it is not really reflective of what the coffee is valued at. Of course, there's reasons why the prices go up and down. They have so much more to do with what is expected in like 6 to 18 months than they are anything to do with anything else at all. That was a lot of words to say. I don't really have anything to say about this.
No, I get where you're going with this in the sense that no one can really tell what's going to happen, right?
It will go up. I can promise you that.
You don't think it'll go down further?
Sure, it'll go down.
There was no timing attached to any of that. At some point, it might go lower. At some
There's
point,
a ball,
it will go higher.
There's a ball falling right now. It may have hit the ground and it may not have, but either way, it's going to hit the ground and then it's going to bounce up.
So what?
Like this is what it's done for like the last 40 years or whatever. Yeah. So
the guests that we've had on the show have been telling us that their commodity coffee, they're just cutting it down. They're not even picking it. They're just picking their specialty.
Yeah.
So if the commodity price doesn't play a big role, or historically anyway, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but historically, when stuff like this happens and people start cutting down their commodity crops and trying to fill those with, you know, specialty coffee-ish varietals, what ends up happening typically with the specialty trade? Do you know?
Wait, I want to make sure that I understand this. Are you saying that previous guests have said that they're not paying attention to the commodities prices?
Well, so what they've decided to do is they have some crops that are commodity and some crops that are specialty. They cut down. They've decided that they're only going to pick their specialty crops and they're cutting down all their commodity. They're just macheting the trees.
Yeah. Okay. So we're talking about suppliers.
Growers.
Yeah.
Do you think that something like that could have an en masse effect? Do you think that that could be a trend?
If prices are really low and they're getting rid of their specialty coffee trees to grow cheaper and more bountiful coffee, that will be a bad thing. When prices go really high too, there's potentially less incentive. When prices are lower, it usually does mean that there's potentially, it depends on kind of like where you are on the spectrum as a grower. If you're kind of at specialty and can push your quality higher, then you're incentivized to do so that you can kind of separate yourself from the commodity market and find discerning buyers who will pay more. If you're kind of on the lower side in either situation, high or low, then you're more incentivized to just essentially like cut all of your costs and assume that you can move all your coffee at a commodity price. So it really depends on where your quality is relative to where it can go, and how much, like what your cost structure looks like now, and things like that. But the final thing too is just like I don't think we've really seen, I expect that in some time in our lifetime, we will see coffee prices, the commodity prices really start to crawl way up.
Yeah.
And I think that will be a day of reckoning for specialty coffee, because it could become very difficult for a grower to justify spending extra effort on their coffee at that point.
What do you think it would do to the industry? That's a big question. Yeah. I get that it's a big question, but I think it's important that we start thinking about stuff like that, because I was thinking about that. If this market keeps going down and we end up having people cutting down commodity trees and just planting specialty, and we have a swing towards specialty, and then the commodity price goes up, like really up, then these people who are not paying what specialty coffee is worth could potentially end up shooting themselves in the foot.
It depends on how, I think the two big factors that I have in my head right now are how fast it goes up and how long it stays up. And I would probably put more emphasis on the first of those. If it's something that crawls up slowly over time, specialty can adjust slowly over time, assuming that customers get used to just seeing higher prices everywhere. If it's spiked up, it could be really, really difficult for a specialty coffee company and a lot easier for a company who had deeper pockets and could weather such a storm. Especially if they believed that it was giving them an opportunity to potentially to essentially get a competitive advantage over their like competing companies.
My fear in something like that is we're going to experience something similar to what's going on in the Australian coffee industry right now. It's a very mature industry over there, and wages are extremely high, margins are low, and people are finding that the best way to at least create a tiny little bit of room on their bottom line is by buying cheaper coffee. And so if the prices do go up and people end up trying to get to the cheaper coffees, well, we're doing a disservice to our customers, aren't we?
Yeah.
That's my.
So are you saying there's a big difference between the best coffees and the worst coffees at some of these specialty coffee companies?
I'm saying that there's a game going on. And yes, essentially that's what I'm saying. The Mark Dundon, when he was, I don't know if you've ever had the pleasure of meeting Mark. He's an absolute sweetheart. He was on the show a couple months ago, and we were talking. He had written an article, "Specialty Coffee is Dead to Me." And I've been fascinated by the idea of what do we really mean by specialty coffee? Again, this standardized list of terms, right? And so when we talk about this idea of specialty, the big issue is that in Australia, the front end of specialty seems to have been taken care of. $1 million fit outs is the average fit out now in Australia. We pay our baristas really well. Everything looks pretty and it's got edible flowers on it. And, we've got red fucking beetroot lattes, et cetera, and every milk under the sun. But farmers are getting paid less than they were getting paid 30 years ago. And so we haven't taken care of the back end of specialty. And so there's these cafes that are presenting themselves as specialty, but specialty started off as a way to describe a certain kind of coffee, not a mindset of the way a business works, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of from a marketing perspective. This is coffee's. The thing that coffee has to bear is that there is. I used to be able to say there is an exploitative history of coffee buying, and so we are cursed essentially to have to continue to make that a central point in the way that we talk about that people talk to their customers about how they purchase and acquire the coffee. You don't see this I don't see this elsewhere. Maybe a little bit in chocolate, but it seems like I've never heard anyone wonder like how much was the winemaker paid for this bottle. Like that's not. I'm trying
to think of any other industry. I don't think nobody cares.
Clothing is another one. I mean, there are some. But it's the sad thing to me is that when I see the sea this low, it reminds me like, oh yeah, that's not just our past. Maybe that's something that we're very much still right in the middle of. I would like to see it get out of that. I oddly think that if we stopped talking about that so much, we might actually just be willing to pay the higher prices. There's something about the person who's like talking so much about how much they pay, and it's like, one, that's good and noble of you, but your purchases are inconsequential. So your purchases are consequential, but you're in the scheme of like how much coffee is.
Nestle is going to move the needle. We're not going to move the needle. You know, like that's context.
Yeah, I kind of buy into something that George Howell convinced me of 10 or 15 years ago, which is that like what is happening at the highest end is going to move the needle of the larger companies such as Nestle. And I meant, I mean, like, I hope that that's true because that's what I spent my career in coffee working on. But what I mean, like, essentially, like what I don't see the larger companies doing as much, what I see more of the smaller companies doing is talking about how much they pay the suppliers, not talking about how great the coffee is, not talking about, and just like the thing that is managed, the thing that is measured is what's managed. So I wonder sometimes if we spent more time talking about how exceptional a coffee was, how great a coffee tasted, how unique it is, and less about how it was traded for or purchased, if that wouldn't be something that would actually help over time really truly lift coffee out of a commodity status and into a luxury good specialty status.
That's a fantastic way of looking at it. I'd never thought about that idea before. Like make it about the customer rather than us.
Yeah, I mean that's what most successful industries do.
I know, it's such a novel idea, isn't it? This idea of, hey, let's just talk to them about giving them the best coffee that we can afford within the price range of what we're charging them.
Yeah.
And make it about that conversation rather than, it reminds me of those advertisements for World Vision, where they're feeding the poor kids.
Mm-hmm.
That's a conversation I always flick on those ads. It's not a thing that I want to see. And I think if we are talking about, what you're saying is absolutely, I think, part of the solution. Let's focus on the coffee and what the customer wants rather than the back end of the story. Still tell the story of what they're drinking, but we have to care about the back end. They don't necessarily have to.
Yeah.
I see this question come up a lot on social media when it comes in regards to the C, and people keep saying, why does specialty coffee keep giving a shit about the C market given we're independent of that? We're not, though, are we?
No, we're not.
So can you explain for people why we're not? Because I can understand why people think that it's separate, but can you delve into that?
You see people saying this when the price is really low, because when the price is really low, we in specialty coffee walk with our chests puffed up or whatever, really proud of the fact that we pay multiples of the C for our coffee. And I want to point out, like, I am critical of specialty coffee having come from it, but I'm also proud of what we do.
Oh yeah.
But let's just be clear, if the C went up to $5 next week, we would suddenly not be talking about, no one would be saying that they were separated from the C. And it's very easy to do it. If you want to just get in a time machine, also known as just, you can search this on google.com, and go look at the things being written within specialty coffee around 2011, 2012. And that was when the price went above $3. I don't remember what it topped out at. I remember a day at least where it was at $3.11.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say, $3.11.
Yeah. And you will see, a bunch of importers in specialty coffee writing about it. You'll see people within coffee writing about it. There's a ton of just like hand-wringing going on within the companies that I was at, multiple companies during that time. And just like we're not independent of the C. We're independent of the C when it's low, and we very much like,
we like to
flip out when it goes up.
We like to shout that from the rooftops, right? We're so much better than the commodity market when it's low, but when it's at its highest, everyone kind of looks around and doesn't want anyone paying attention.
Yeah, it's within historical norms that it could go above $3. It could get there pretty quickly, and if it did, and let's say it went above $4, just like look at your inventory. I'm saying $4 is the C price, meaning like landed to you for great coffee, we're talking like $5 or $6. A lot of the producers you're working with, you're you know you're paying less than that, and so just ask yourself, are they like, how excited will they be to get paid less money for all of the extra work that they do than what they could just openly sell the coffee for,
As someone
no
who's
matter
never
how great your relationship is.
Well, as someone who's never negotiated a green price before, I've never been a coffee buyer. I've never had to get involved in that side of things. We at Elixir don't roast our own coffee as a part of our business model. We want to work with roasters and whatnot. But could you tell me, like, how does that conversation go when you're trying to negotiate a price? Does it, especially if the C price goes up and you're buying specialty, does it come into the conversation from a farmer?
Yeah, so this is potentially where I will lose all those job offers that we talked about earlier. I never negotiated a price. I would typically, if I was really interested in a coffee, I would usually work out with the producer what the price of that coffee should be from what they thought it should be. And I always, that was never a problem. Sometimes it meant, oh, like, okay, at that price, I can't buy 20 bags. I can only buy 10 bags, but it was never like deals off, like not taking anything, not taking anything over 305 or anything like that. So that was probably, I mean, again, it's because of specialty coffee and our purchases are inconsequential, and really like it was pretty easy for us to adjust pricing based on those things. And the math that I was doing in my head is, if your coffee is $3.75 and I buy 10 bags of it, I think that will have to sell at X and it will last us Y months. And that would be a good amount of time.
But you guys at Ritual didn't have set prices, right? So I'm
Correct.
assuming we're talking about Ritual times here. So
Ritual was where I was doing like where I had the most control over pricing, both from a cost and a to customer point of view, and then also just like, just all the structure around how we did that.
Because I really liked what you were talking about in the book with regards to having a buying philosophy, and I could see how if a company's philosophy was, we buy coffees at this much and we sell them at this much, and it gives you a very thin and narrow kind of bracket to move within to focus on taste rather than affordability. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're as a green buyer and your philosophy is, we buy coffees that are X, Y, and Z, you then can shift your prices based on what your costs are, right?
Yeah, I mean, you either decide that your customers can only spend a certain amount of money, and so you just buy the things that fit that, and then when you do spend a lot of time with a relationship and you find coffee you want and they're above that, then you feel like you have to negotiate. Or you can, as I decided from talking with customers at Ritual, decide in certain cases people are willing to spend extra for unique experiences. And so it's okay for me to buy this coffee at this price because it just means that I'll have to charge this. And I think there's around this much that we could buy at that price and like move through it in a few months.
Do you see the role of a green buyer as, and I've been thinking about this a little bit, of how would you describe the essence of what a green buyer does? And I guess in a more poetic kind of way, you're a curator of flavor for the brand that you represent. Mm-hmm. Would you say that that's accurate?
Yes, I think as a green buyer, you are creating a philosophy around what it is that your brand's coffee tastes like. the range of flavors. And then also, I think an important thing that a coffee buyer should be involved with, if not the sole arbiter of, is how do we talk about our coffee? How do we talk about our relationships with coffee growers or other suppliers? And how do we describe why a coffee tastes the way it does?
How about the relationship with regards to how the coffees then turn brown? That was huge, Ryan.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I hate talking about that. To me, that was always, probably just because it was uninteresting to me. I didn't want to talk about it at any of our, but like at Ritual, we didn't talk about that, but it was also, that also was informed. I mean, it all goes back to the thing I said before, which is like what it is you talk about when you talk about coffee. So at Pete's, we very much talked primarily about the way that the coffee was roasted. Mm. At Ritual, we talked almost not at all about how the coffee was roasted. I wanted the focus at Ritual to be on the producers and what it was, not from an origin perspective, but from a producer perspective, what it is that they did to make the coffee taste the way it tasted. So that meant that, and essentially for every coffee we had these notes that I would create, which were the talking points for baristas.
Did you ever have the word shiny in there as a flavor profile? Did you ever see that? Intelligentsia did that once. Back in the day.
No, I mean, I don't think I did that, but I'm in favor of
shiny.
I'm in favor of whatever flavor notes people want, whatever, like however you want to describe the coffee. Blue Bottle, James Freeman at Blue Bottle has a unique way of describing his coffees. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Oh yeah.
Or how he does it, but and he has a book also that he wrote, and my favorite part of the book was where he talks about how he talks about coffee.
Interesting you say that. We made a decision at Elixir we would never release flavor profiles.
Sure.
For that same reason. It's like our whole thing is like we don't tell anyone how it's made purely because we want you to have an authentic relationship with this beverage. By then going and telling you how it should taste is the complete polar opposite of that. So we decided we're not going to tell you that this should taste like blueberry juice. No. However you experience that, that's the correct way to experience it.
Yeah, and I respect that. Like, I think that's part of deciding. That's like a decision.
Exactly
like, this is how we're going to talk about the coffee, and because at the end of the day, you are creating an experience for someone, and there are advantages and disadvantages to telling someone what they might expect to drink. So
I completely derailed what you were saying. Sorry.
That's
do
okay.
you remember what you were saying about how the conversation versus on the producer rather than the roast at Ritual, and at Ritual you were insisting.
And then just like at Stumptown, it was somewhere kind of in the middle of those two things, and at Tonks we kind of were more in the camp of Ritual, but in a very different way. But we, Tony and I both kind of described like the roasting part of the process isn't something we should talk about or even like show photos of. Like he used to go deep into the metaphor of how the sausage is being made as a metaphor. And he would describe like, you like show the pig and then, you're like, and then you're serving breakfast. You don't show the parts in between. Like, that's not interesting. Like, you know, in the famous Portlandia sketch, they asked what the chicken's name was. It was Colin, by the way. But they didn't ask like, how was this chicken slaughtered? They wanted to know like the name of the chicken and how it was treated before that. But yeah, we can't like, and I think that's what roasting is. But like Pete's felt differently, Stumptown felt differently. It was a big part of the culture, and kind of a core value was how the coffees were roasted.
So did you, as a green buyer, did you have a say in the different places that you work? Did you have conversations with roasters about how coffees should be roasted based on the different coffees that you had bought? Or was that a part of the cupping process? The discussion that I loved how much you talk about cupping, I can't speak, cupping, by the way, in the book.
Yeah. So typically typically as I was returning from trips and making purchases, I would be talking with my head roaster or roasters about sort of like, hey, these are the coffees we got, and the coffee from like Alejandro this year is just exceptional. I'm like really excited for you all to taste that. They would cup. I would always want, as much as possible, I found tasting coffee by myself to be boring and not useful. And I learned so much more from cupping with other people. Even it didn't matter if they were like less experienced as a cupper than me at all. And a lot of times that was actually more helpful.
How so, if you don't mind me asking?
Because I mean, you mean like why an inexperienced cupper might be more helpful?
Yeah, because I as much as I've cupped, I still consider myself really inexperienced, because every time I cup, all I can ever smell, and it's going to sound ridiculous, but all I can ever smell is meat. Cooked meat.
Oh yeah, sure.
Meat.
I've heard that before.
Everything I smell is meat.
Wait, everything outside of coffee as well?
No. Just
okay. You might literally just be smelling the meat of your own body, like inside your nostrils or something. But
really?
No. If you're just talking about coffee, no.
No, I'm just talking about coffee. Whenever I smell ground coffee, it doesn't matter whether it's just being ground at the machine or in a cupping situation. And then when you break the crust, I still just smell baked meat. And I'm like, I'm a really shit cupper. I have nothing to contribute to this conversation ever. So what would you get from me?
I might not invite you actually then to...
Great. Done. We'll just go for dinner. It's fine. I mean, usually the reason inexperienced cupper over a more experienced cupper is, and it depends on both, but an inexperienced cupper might say things, there's like less to guard or protect, so they might be more forthright with askew comments, whereas a more experienced cupper knows what to say.
Yeah, especially as you get like deeper, you're just like, there's like, I would sometimes, like I remember the first time I cupped with a Leco. We were both in Costa Rica and I was working for Rachel and he was in Stumptown. And I remember I was nervous enough that like it was hard. I was like not actually getting anything left in my spoon
and choking on what you did get into your mouth.
Yeah, which is silly. I know. I think I've told him that. And he was just like, that's ridiculous. But just, like a very inexperienced cupper will potentially give you just like raw, interesting ways of understanding or interpreting what you've just tasted that you would not hear from a more experienced cupper who's just been like both indoctrinated in positive ways and then also sort of as a result of becoming indoctrinated, blinded to new ways of looking at something.
That's awesome. That's exciting.
But yeah, usually I would cup the coffees with like, any pre-ship samples or arrivals or anything like that with the roasters. And what's important for me is that the coffee as it arrives is the coffee. And sometimes coffee buyers would romanticize a coffee the way they remember first tasting it and expect a roaster to do some sort of wizardry to make the coffee essentially taste young again. But the reality is that the roasters I worked with were always really incredible at being able to take what I brought to them and make it just like sing.
That's exciting.
Truthfully, roasting. I never felt like I worked with roasters who just like were like ruining my art or anything like that. I always felt really lucky with the way that the roasting teams that I worked with roasted the coffees.
Is it important when putting together a team? Let's say you're a new, you're a roaster who's been roasting for a few years, and you've decided to start. You're going to bring on board a green buyer. How important actually is the relationship between the green buyer and the roaster? Is it like in a band, the bass player and the drummer need to be in sync? Is it that same kind of thing?
I don't really think so.
So they don't need to complement each other?
I don't think so. But again, like maybe I like don't see that because I feel like I had great roasters.
Yeah, I could see that.
Always. When we brought Steve Ford on at Ritual, I liked him because I felt like we needed someone to be criticizing what we were doing more than we had in the company at the time. And I felt like he and I were really complementary in the way that we tasted coffee. Steve, I used to joke that Steve would like very easily zero in on the most salient character of any given coffee, good or bad. And so like the joke with him used to be that like he would just like sip a coffee and just be like banana cream pie, or like on the other hand, like I think the famous one that he denies ever saying was shoe store floor.
Because he's walked around licking the shoe store floor before, right?
Possibly.
Hey, we can't judge.
But also, like he almost wouldn't be able to. And this isn't true, but he almost like wouldn't be able to taste anything else other than that one most salient characteristic. But also, as soon as he said it, like you almost couldn't taste anything else. Also,
yeah, wow.
But I like loved that. So,
and it's important to have people. I guess the vibe that I got from your book about the idea of cupping with other people, it's cup with everybody, but when you're cupping with like your inner circle, make sure they're people who are confident and comfortable enough with you that they can tell you what they're tasting, authentically tasting, not just trying to make you feel good about what your decisions are as a buyer.
Oh yeah. I think probably because I invited, I feel like no one was ever telling me they liked a coffee that they didn't like just so that I felt better. I think that among my super strengths is getting people to tell me that my shit is not good is one of them. So yeah, like that was, if you can do that, you should do that, because you just need to be honest about what the quality of your arrivals are, the coffees that you've purchased. And also potentially like before you've purchased them, if like you spend a lot of time on a relationship, but the coffee's just not good, you need a team who can tell you, hey, this is not good. It doesn't always mean that you can't buy the coffee. That's like a whole other calculation that you need to make, but it definitely, you should know what it is that you're buying and be very honest about that.
So something I've always wondered, and I've never remembered to ask anyone, maybe you can help me with this. What happens if you buy a coffee and it turns up and it's just shit? It's so different from what you tasted at origin. And now after reading it, I understand what all the things that can go wrong are. But clearly from what you were saying in the book, it happens, and it happens more often than you would want it to, for no particular fault of anyone. There's a whole bunch of reasons it can happen. What do you do when that shows up and it's just not drinkable?
I want to say it doesn't happen often. It happens more than you want it to, means it ever happens, because you don't ever want that to happen. You have to pretty quickly decide whether or not you have to have a good understanding and an open line of communication with suppliers about whether or not something bad happened with the way that it was packaged or transported to you, or if the reality is the coffee that you bought, what it is that you liked about it was not something that was a stable characteristic. So what I mean by that is, if you buy it, like, so a great example is if you buy a coffee that was like, oh, this is like really interesting and fruity, it's like a lot of fruit, and it's potentially because it's like a pulpy coffee or an over fermented coffee, or dear God, a natural. I'm joking about that, but I mean, something like a natural from a potentially humid place, and then it doesn't taste the same when it arrives. Like, I don't know that was necessarily because it was transported poorly. Like you may have bought an unstable coffee, and that is on you. Or if you bought a coffee that was not fully dried, and you encourage them to move it fast, and so they moved a coffee that was at 14% moisture or something like that. That is the buyer's fault. That's not someone else's fault.
But if it's like the example that you used with regards to the different ways of packaging the coffee, the burlap bags versus the Grain Pro, and how there was some bags that can actually, some coffee that took on board the flavor of the bags that it was transported in. What happens in that situation? So it arrives and it tastes like petroleum-ish or whatever. You can't send the coffee back, can you?
They did.
Oh, really?
So that was Cup of Excellence, 2006. And I can't remember if I divulged the origin, but it was Honduras. And a bunch of people didn't buy from Honduras for years after that as a result of it.
This was Honduras, wasn't it?
Yeah, 2006.
Yeah, you did talk about that, and that the fact that people still don't buy from that origin because of it, unfairly, of course. But
I think that's mostly changed by now. But it was notable buyers who were buying from that COE back in 2006. And as a result, they sort of avoided Honduras for a few years after that, which was a huge opportunity for a bunch of the smaller roasters who had not experienced that, to jump in and create strong relationships, especially with Beneficio San Vicente in Santa Barbara. So yeah, all of this is, you can essentially try to contest the quality of an arrival, and you might even be successful in getting that coffee off your books. But with all of these things, what you are doing is building or destroying a relationship with a supplier. And you just need to understand that it's not necessarily something that will only affect you or the roaster. It will potentially affect both you and the roaster or company for a long time after that, if you are not careful with this. So the best way that I can recommend, if you receive a coffee and it tastes bad, and I mean like particularly bad. So if you bought an 86 or an 87 and it arrives as an 84 or an 85, it's just kind of like, that's like, unless you can like really pinpoint a specific type of defect, like that is a completely reasonable slippage in quality. If you receive something that's considerably worse than that, you need to open up your line of communication with that supplier. And they, just like you, are trying to create good long-term relationships. The reality is, while you might be their customer, there's a lot fewer of them than there are of you, more than likely, depending on how big you are. And you don't want to burn those bridges. So be really sure that it's something that you can't do something with. Be really sure that you feel like something wrong happened.
What are the alternatives that you could use the coffee for? Like, how do you just use it if you had bought it with the intention of serving as a single, is it something that you put in a blend instead?
I mean, if you have a blend, if you can do that, the difficult thing about this is just like, there's n number of kind of scenarios in which, we have a blend, we have a dark roast blend, we have we don't have a blend, we have cold brew, things like that. So there's definitely possibilities. You don't want to do that too often. It could be like really off in a way that, sometimes when I'm accidentally shipped a natural, I try to see if I can what if I just do a batch that's like 10% of this natural and like 90% of a nicer coffee. By the way, I blend coffees. I don't even care, all of you. And
did you buy off the new Yes Please Kickstarter?
I did. I did too. I'm helping them.
Yes,
I was on the Kickstarter.
Are you part of? Are you helping them launch the brand?
I am their green coffee advisor.
Oh, I like that. Congratulations. I supported your Kickstarter. Just so that
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I bet you I get the coffee when I'm in Australia next month. I've been waiting for fucking months for this coffee after they've been talking about the blend. Nobody blends coffee properly. I'm like, all right, motherfuckers, I want to see exactly what you mean. I love Sumi and Tony. I just want to see this. And then I get the email. I'm like, fuck, this coffee's going to arrive in October. I know it. Oh, well.
Does that, is it being shipped to you in Los Angeles?
I'm in San Diego, but it'll get shipped here in San Diego. But I'm assuming, is it shipping in October? Do you know?
I don't actually know.
Yeah, no. Well, the email came out to all the backers saying, "Oh, it's shipping soon. We still don't know when, but we're almost there." And I'm like, I bet Murphy's Law is that this is going to end up. And, it was really great for anyone who is thinking of doing a Kickstarter for their coffee company and you find delays. Yes, Please has done the right thing, given that there's been such a delay. They're like, we're going to give you an extra bag of coffee because you've had to wait so long. Again, it's about customer service, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I do strongly agree that most of the time it would be easier to create a great blend than a great single origin coffee. Of course, the result of what you see in a lot of places is just the very carefully selected single origins. And even those often, as we're pointing out, like right now, can arrive in a way that you didn't expect them to arrive. And a blend, I think someone who really puts the effort into a great blend can create a consistently, and it's not just consistency, but like a consistently great drinking experience.
Where did the idea that blends are fucked up come from? Because I've never seen it that way, and I'm quite confused why people are turning against blends.
Well, there's a realistic history of you set the blend here. I mean, it's going back to the pricing conversation, right? So the blend should be the same price at all times, and so the roaster then becomes motivated to optimize for cost cutting and versus anything else. Okay. And so you just like slowly are pushing the cost down versus a single origin where you can price it relative to a number of factors, including what you paid for the coffee. Yeah. And so you're not necessarily motivated to cut costs. You're potentially motivated to find the best tasting thing because the customer is experiencing it with
milk and sugar and
or just like no expectations, and so they're going to judge it based on how much they enjoy it, not based on like it's the right name and it like tastes like all coffee mixed together. So
there's something I want to ask you about that I have not asked anyone about, but I've become rather curious about in the last couple of months, and that's China. Do you know anything about coffee? And so I received an email a couple of weeks ago now from, they're not a coffee buying company. They're like a supermarket buyer. And the numbers that they were spewing in that email about the projected growth of coffee consumption in China was astronomical.
Yeah.
And so I hear that they're planting coffee plantations in China. I'm hearing some people say that the coffee tastes amazing and some people saying that the coffee tastes shit. I don't know. Like, do you have any thoughts on or any experience on coffee in China and what are those thoughts?
I am skeptical that the coffee is tasting amazing by the standards of most of the listeners of this show. Mm-hmm. It's entirely possible, but the reality is that most of what we need to make a coffee taste great is just terroir and elevations that are, I don't think, available.
They'll just fucking build mountains, mate. Don't you know that's what China does? Like, come on, they'll just create elevation. What are you talking about?
The coffee consumption is interesting though, and it reminds me that again, like the C price is low, and I just don't believe that. Like I believe that there will be a reckoning day at some point.
Oh, I
where
agree.
The C price, where coffee is just very, very expensive.
Because the rates that this email was talking about was in the order of 75% increase of coffee consumption over the span of 4 years.
Yeah. Yeah. That's wild.
We're talking about over 1 billion people. Like they are big numbers. And because of that projected growth, they are asking if I can recommend suppliers of instant coffee, of green coffee, and of roasted coffee for supermarkets. I'm like, not for that many people. I know people who can give you maybe a ton a week, maybe, but not for a 75% increase of over 1 billion people. No, we're the wrong company for that.
Yeah. I tasted a handful of coffees from China back in the day. I'm sure that like the coffee quality has improved. They were kind of like the typical one that I remember. Probably the best one I remember was maybe a mid to high 70 scoring coffee, and it was like no sweetness, nothing wrong with it, like a clean coffee that was just
tasted like coffee.
Mostly just uninteresting characteristics generally, like not the acidity wasn't interesting. I don't recall it being particularly sweet, but it was like clean. The green looked clean, but we're talking about many years ago. So
I know you're not an I can never fucking say that word. Agronomist.
An agronomist, yeah.
There's some words that if there's too many R's in there, Australians can't say them. I particularly can't. I know you're not an agronomist. Fuck. I have to remove that word from my vocabulary. But you talk a lot about like using the quality of water at different stages is more important than other stages. And so that makes me think about China and pollution and what kind of role you think that could play in inhibiting the quality of the kinds of coffees that could come out of somewhere like China, given the levels of air pollution that they have.
Truthfully, I don't really feel equipped to talk about what it is like to grow or process coffee in China. I have never visited the country and furthermore have not visited on the basis of like visiting coffee farms or coffee growers there. And so in my head, there's all sorts of just like stereotypical images of what cities in China look like, which
with
are
no
very
people
far,
in them.
Very, very, very far from where the coffee is grown, I assume. So I don't really feel equipped to talk about China.
It's definitely going to be an interesting one to watch as it evolves as a part of the greater coffee scheme of things, particularly with what's going on with the sea versus what's going on with specialty and all of that. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean from both sides. I think especially the consumption side. More than the production side, but I'm usually wrong on these things. So who knows, like what access we'll have to coffees from China in the future here in the States.
You when I first started out in coffee, I was asking what I thought were really dumb questions about green coffee. And I remember saying my very first job out of corporate in a cafe. And I said to the barista, the head barista there, I said, how long can we store green coffee? And he said, well, the people we buy it from store it for 6 years.
Okay.
And that was legit 15 years ago.
Yeah.
15, 17 years ago. So 6 years they stored it for back then. And so as I was reading through the book about this idea of what is a seasonal coffee and when is it past crop and all these kinds of things, again, we're going back to terms that really aren't defined anymore. And I loved how you said a coffee is in season as long as it's tasting like it's still in season. I'd never heard of it described that way because I think people think, oh, a coffee's in season until the next crop has been put on a boat somewhere.
Yeah.
So how does that evolve, this idea of how long you're allowed to store a green coffee?
Yeah. I mean, some people really like rules, and I think that rules can make certain judgments and decisions easier. And then I think certain rules really do a disservice to certain coffees. So I have been guilty of exploring the idea of, like, we had a blend at Ritual that was meant to be made exclusively of coffees that had been harvested within the past 12 months, which in 2007 was kind of a fresh idea, certainly less fresh these days.
Was that a part of like a philosophy approach, or was it something you were aiming specifically for?
It was part of a philosophy. But I want to be clear too, like it also is just, it's easy to have rules like that because you can just follow them and you just know, hey, we can't put this in here because this doesn't fit. And we can put this in there because it does fit that criteria. And then the other thing is, of course, just like if you're buying proper, it's also like it's a good sort of like check on how you're buying, because if you have that rule, then you can't say like, oh, it's fine, we can always just like throw it in the blend if it's too much. You have to be like, no, we should buy less because, you know, we already have a bunch of stuff for the blend in a few months, and we can't also add this because then we'd be breaking our rules. But what I noticed was some obsession with freshness rules for a little bit, for probably honestly just like a little while, that seemed to do a disservice to certain origins that, and the ones that always come to my mind are Ethiopia and Kenya, where the quality of those coffees often does not seem to diminish 12, 24 months later. I'm not recommending that you ever plan on that because it will probably backfire, but it would similarly be just like unnecessarily cruel to point out that a coffee was old that still tastes fresh, especially when you have some coffees that are 8, 12 weeks old, and for whatever reason, because of the way that they have been stored, taste old. You can't keep walking around and say, hey, this thing that tastes like a brown paper bag is fresh. So it's just, all of these things are like ways to avoid, just like cup the coffee and decide whether or not it is something that you can justifiably say is fresh. So there's a whole lot of factors when you buy a bag of granola from the store and then put it in your pantry. Like if you just leave the bag open, it's going to taste bad pretty soon. It doesn't matter what the date on the bag says. And if you are good about the way that you store it, it could still taste really great weeks after that date, and should probably still keep eating it if it does. To just like get it out of coffee as a metaphor. So yeah, just taste your coffee, be honest with yourself about if it still is fresh or if it has picked up flavors or lost flavors as a consequence of being old.
How did you learn to do that? Because that to me sounds like it goes into this whole idea of learning how to forecast and learning how to know how much is enough, right? And the thing that we keep getting asked to ask people that come in this show is, how do we learn how to forecast, and how do we know how to read how long a coffee should last? And
I mean, so probably the amount of time that I have some recommendations in the book that spell this out in a little bit more detail. The two biggest problems I see are, I would always assume that you want a coffee to last 3 to 4 months. Definitely not more than that. Less than that is
your 3-6-12 rule, right?
It is, yeah.
I love that.
It's a little bit of the 3-6-12.
Yeah.
And the 3-6-12 is, in short, essentially like on hand, you should have about 3 months worth of coffee. Not necessarily in your roasting space, but just like that's what you have either in your roastery and or like in a
storage room, like accessible. Yeah.
Accessible, yeah, even if it means like with your importer, but it's here. It's not like on the water or like, oh, it's almost here. Like, no, like it's here. Have about 3 months worth of coffee. You should understand very clearly what your next 6 months worth of arrivals look like. And you should be arranging your coffee for the next 12 months. And it's a guideline that I will say too, that the 3 is much more important than the 6 is much more important than the 12. And like all of, by more important, I just mean if your 3 is all messed up, if you have way too much coffee or you have way too little coffee, you kind of don't have the luxury of thinking about 6 or 12, and likewise for 6 about 12, et cetera. But I think the biggest pitfall I see with forecasting that I committed multiple times in my coffee buying career was either believing by my own sort of forecasts that that the company I was roasting or buying coffee for would grow at all, or being told by someone that it would grow at all. So with the possible exception of, we have not yet opened our first cafe and we're about to open our first cafe, and yes, you're going to need coffee for that first cafe. Right. But really, like, buy as much coffee as you currently consume. Don't buy more than that. And that seems like, well, then we're like, but we know that we're opening another cafe and it's just going to grow really fast. Like, you might not know that. It might not be as popular as you're hoping. And at the very least, be extremely conservative with that. And the main reason is, it is so much easier to buy more coffee than it is to get rid of coffee that you have already committed to. And it's, you know, there's just like a ton of people who want to sell you coffee. So just like, you know, just like chill out, don't buy the coffee. I promise that it's a lot more fun of a problem to have to get coffee than to have to get rid of coffee, because you're a coffee buyer, you're not a coffee seller.
On that, I had a situation with a client. I had 2 clients that I was connecting. One that was a roaster that was starting a wholesale program, and another one who was looking to switch. The current roaster that they were using, one of them was a donut shop and the other one is a roaster. And the donut shop was expanding at a phenomenal rate. This was the story we were getting told. And so, Lee, you need to find us the right roaster. This is a perfect match. The brands are, you can already see where this is going, right?
Yeah.
You know, the brands were a great match for each other. So they started working together, and the donut shop had an investor come in and decide that, yes, they were going to open up 10 more stores. And they go live on the first store, and we're waiting for the first order. And we find out that the store opened and they were using another roaster.
I'm sorry. I shouldn't laugh. I'm sorry.
Oh, but it you know.
I shouldn't laugh, but I am laughing.
But it's this. It happens all the time, right? And so we were lucky that we had decided that, and it was all this roaster's decision. He was the smart person here, and he turned around and he said, "I'm not going to buy any extra green until they tell me that they are going to put the first order in." Good. And because if I put that first order in, and I'm going to get lumped with it, my business isn't big enough to carry the load. He's a smart person. He's a really smart guy. And he wasn't prepared to be like, well, just because you tell me you're going to open 10 stores, I've been in business long enough to know that the fantasies don't always happen the way that we predict that they're going to happen.
Yeah. And again, if you're good about the 3 months thing, it's not, I mean, you're not running on 3 days worth of coffee. You're running on 3 months. So like, yes, if you open a new cafe, you might start to go below that 3 and just like, cool, that's great. You know what? That means you still got a job. You have to go buy coffee. Go buy coffee.
Yeah.
Go buy coffee, coffee buyer.
It's not the situation that Blue Bottle had in Japan.
Oh, you mean like the line,
Yeah, the
like
6-hour
down 2
line,
blocks?
and they went through 6 months worth of green in 3 weeks, and
Yeah.
like that seems like quite a terrifying position to be in. But it's not that situation. Like,
Yeah. There's good problems to have and bad problems to have, and not having enough coffee is definitely a good problem to have
yeah,
because you have all of the muscles in place to buy coffee. There was a time at Stumptown where we had to sell coffee, and it was incredibly unpleasant. And we had to tell a lot of people who we had made commitments to that we could not. What am I trying to say? We could not commit to that.
fulfill. Okay.
Fulfill that, yeah. And that was very painful. And I'm like, I still feel like I walk around with embarrassment about that if I ever see those people. Because and it's just like and I felt like unfortunately that followed me, and it sadly wasn't even entirely my fault, and it just was what it was. But it was because we were told we were going to be like tripling the number of cafes at
Yeah, I
one
read
point,
that.
and that obviously did not happen.
In a situation like that, do you get told go and buy extra coffee because we're going to be opening these cafes, or how does something like that? Okay.
I mean, in that case, yes. In another case, I just really assumed like, oh, we're going to grow really fast. I should buy a lot more coffee, and that was the wrong thing to do.
But a learning moment as well. I mean, yeah, there are consequences to that, but it teaches you how not and why not to do it in the future, right?
Yeah. I will never do that again.
You've definitely had some experiences.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Do you think that on a serious note, do you think you'll come back to coffee?
I don't know. It would. The thing that really motivates me these days is doing something new for an audience that is potentially underserved, and I have a hard time thinking of what that might be in coffee right now. I want to say I think there's all sorts of interesting, unique ways that coffee businesses are approaching how they're serving customers. So I'm not saying, hey, you all need to inspire me or anything like that. But yeah, I haven't like, there's been a few things I've been close to exploring, but they just, either the like opportunity wasn't kind of like interesting enough, or just like fell apart for one reason or another. Yeah.
I've got to ask you, where do you think blockchain sits into the coffee industry, given that there are a couple of people that are popping up now saying, starting this idea of blockchain and traceability and transparency, et cetera, et cetera?
I don't know that I mean, like, I see how it could potentially be used for certain, like, some of the stuff that Bellwether is potentially doing around how roasters can buy coffee. I could see how that could make use of blockchain, from the way that most coffee is traded through essentially a different type of chain, a supply chain. Like, I don't see where blockchain fits into or like helps add transparency to that process in a way that would be worth the effort. That's my imperfect answer.
I'm still trying to understand blockchain, and it's a little more complex than I had anticipated. But do you think it could be something that could replace the C market if it got enough steam behind it? If people traded coffee with blockchain on a blockchain?
Yeah, I don't. That you have. You've broken past the point of my understanding of blockchain as well. And for that matter, honestly, like economics. So
great. Okay. I just assume everybody knows more than me about any of this stuff because I spend so much time trying to understand. And I'm like, I still don't get blockchain. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. But I do see a way that it could be, if we reached enough people that had decided, this is how I'm going to trade my coffee from now on much like people have decided that they're going to take their money from money to Bitcoin, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but you would then need to all be trading in the same currency that was on whatever blockchain platform.
Yeah, potentially. I'm also unsure exactly how blockchain handles sort of like different qualities or tiers of a unit that it's measuring or recording. So yeah, this is fun though. I like the idea of just like the two of us who don't know about blockchain talking about blockchain.
Talking about something we don't know anything about.
Two people who don't know about blockchain talking about blockchain.
And solving all the coffee problems of the C market using a subject we know nothing about. And no doubt someone's going to listen to this and be like, it's fucking genius. And I'm like, yeah, we knew that.
Yeah, that one person for every 10 people who are like, what are these two going on about?
These people know nothing. Why are they talking about
this? This is embarrassing. Everything they just said was wrong.
Well,
everything in that sentence was wrong.
I know it's definitely not wrong, because I was talking to somebody about the idea of, could it possibly happen? And they're like, if you had an entire community of people that decided that this was the way that the economics of it was going to work, then yes, it would work.
Sure.
But you would need to get like at least a whole region wanting to trade that way, or everyone that was involved in the supply chain of a particular region involved that way. And that's, I mean, it's a massive undertaking. But
am I allowed to talk about your future guests?
Yeah.
I think that it's very possible, especially with what like his product is, that Norbert might have something very interesting to say about
Actually,
this.
that's a great. So we're talking about Norbert from Cropster for anyone who's listening. He's coming on the podcast on Monday, which Cropster announced. Cropster was so funny. They were just like, so Norbert's going to be on Lee's podcast on Monday. I'm like, oh, thanks for that.
Wait, did you not know that?
I knew that, but we hadn't announced it yet.
Oh, okay. I thought you were saying that the way to get on Lee's podcast is just to announce it to a large enough audience.
Yeah, that works too for anyone who wants to just tell the world you're coming on the podcast, and I'll arrange it. But no, you're right. It might be something that he would be the right person to talk about, given his story of how Cropster was born.
Yeah, I mean, he's deeper in technology, and then also, of course, kind of the way that Cropster was born, which I feel like they've gotten closer to fulfilling now, as like mainly around the tracing coffees. So let me back up. A lot of people, I think about Cropster as their roasting software.
Yeah.
But the way that Cropster started was actually the opposite side. It was essentially adding traceability to coffees as they were leaving Colombia. And being able to like trace a sample from essentially like the original sample all the way through to like, this sample is in this batch that we just roasted.
Because they were three mates that were hanging out in Colombia on coffee farms, weren't they? And then realized that there was this need. Three mates,
that's their tagline. Cropster, three mates on a coffee farm.
In Colombia. Smoking really great cigars, and they decided, we can fix this problem.
Yeah.
And then was born a company.
So Lee, I actually like this. So I think a tradition on this show could be that we actually have Monday, like we have the next guest's conversation for them before they get here.
I really like that idea. It's kind of like Back to the Future.
Yeah. So then with Norbert, you can start off by saying, so Ryan and I talked about your show. And so actually
we decided
we're going to talk about the next guest. We don't need to hear from you, Norbert.
It's fantastic, because after him is actually could be perfect, because after him is Nawar Adra from Sydney, from Collective Roasting Solutions, and Elliot Renecki from Steady State Roasting. and they're going to be making a little bit of an announcement on that show and talking, which Cropster absolutely fits into.
Okay.
Actually, you've started a trend. You got me thinking now, how can we make this work? So Norbert could make the announcement for them.
Yep.
And then they would have to talk about the next guests after them.
Sorry, you both. We're not going to talk about that anymore. We already announced that last show.
Jeff
You have to talk about something else.
It just made me realize how many fucking podcasts I've got before I go to Australia. It's
How
been
many?
like, there's another 6 podcasts before the end of next week.
All right. Wow.
Yeah. And then I go to Australia the week after that. That's pretty scary.
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely not ready yet for that to be what happens this soon into that situation. Yeah. Do you think that you'd ever talk and run workshops and stuff about this kind of stuff? There's definitely a big need.
Did scott-rao put you up to that?
No. I put him up to it. I'm like, can you talk to Ryan about ever doing a workshop for Map It Forward around green buying? He's like, look, the only person that ever should do that is Ryan in the world. Ryan's the only one that should do that. If you ever think about doing that, let me know. We're going to take a bunch of your books to Australia.
Oh, fun. Great.
I
think we can translate them into Australian.
Into Australian?
Yeah.
Yeah, but
change the word friend to mate.
Right. Well, not just that. You used all of the weird, shitty fucking Fahrenheit, and there was no.
Oh, did I really?
At all? Yeah.
No, I don't buy that.
Yeah,
Hold up. Let me just quickly read the book. I mean, I definitely used US dollars at one point. Although honestly, the way I wrote it, it could have been translated into any type of dollar. So
yeah, well, there was let me.
I use percent. Do you use percent in Australia? Is that an Australian thing? Is that an Australian measurement?
We also have roads, and we have airplanes and buildings. Do you know, Ryan, the amount of stupid shit I get asked from Americans about Australia is ridiculous.
Okay, I think I found the one place where I used Fahrenheit and did not translate it into Celsius.
There's 2 that I found, but, we'll just skip those. Just for your next book.
I'm the worst. Okay.
Yeah, clearly, you're terrible. You created this book that's going to help everyone in the coffee industry, but you're such a fucking loser because you
know what, though? Silver liningly, I really do need to do an Australian version of this book.
Yeah. Now you do. And you need to have like little koalas and things on the front, because that would be the American way of creating a book for Australians.
I would do that just for the comment section of some article about it to be like, they speak English in Australia. Like I would do that just for that comment, just for that one comment. I
don't know if I've ever told this story in this podcast, but you'll appreciate this. I was in a lift here and this American, well, of course he was American. I'm living in San Diego, and he picked me up and he said, Australian? I'm like, yeah, like, well done.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, sweetheart, it makes me so fucking angry when Americans confuse Australians and Englanders. It makes us sound so fucking stupid.
Interesting.
And I'm sitting there thinking, wait, Englanders, I'm sure that's not a word. And I kept thinking, maybe it is a word, but I'm sure it's not a word. Englanders is not a thing. And he used it twice more in that conversation. And I'm like, this is gold. This is absolute gold. It makes us sound so fucking stupid when we confuse Australians and Englanders. On that note, Ryan, I have one more question for you. Somebody wants to know, is the book available in a digital format?
It is not.
Will it be?
I don't know. Scott-rao is, so Scott-rao has written a number of coffee books. He was the publisher of this book. He has had negative experiences with doing digital formats.
Yeah.
Where essentially they have been pirated more easily as a consequence of him doing digital formats. He loves to tell the story of a kid who came up to him and was bragging about having pirated this in a place where intellectual property is generally less highly regarded than it is in the West. And so yeah, there's no digital format,
which is fair. I mean, hey, there's a reason for there being no digital format at this point. So
yeah, I get the pain around that. I typically buy digital books first, and then if I really like them and feel like I should have a copy ongoing, I will buy a physical copy after that.
Have you ever bought audio books?
I buy a ton of audiobooks.
Are they? I'm thinking of starting to do that. Actually, props to you. This is the first full book I've read in 3 years. In 3 fucking years. I have so many books that I've started in physical format and have got through none of them all the way. And I felt so proud of myself this morning when I finished this at 6:30 in the morning. But it made me think maybe I should start listening to audiobooks. And I'm hearing a lot of people find that easier to do than
so I listen to a lot of audiobooks. The one thing I'll say, if you listen to podcasts and you're thinking about listening to audiobooks, first off, if you're an adult, if you're even like a younger person listening to a book, like you can absorb as much as you would from reading it. You just you can't quite do it as easily as you would listen to a podcast, because if you kind of tune out during podcasts are kind of well crafted to be tuned in and out of, but if you tune out of a book, you could find yourself like a few chapters later being like, what the hell am I listening to?
Yeah, the mind wanders, no doubt.
Yeah. So you kind of need to break it up into, I mean, for me at least, into like 20 to 30 minute segments where you're really on an autopilot, either in the car or like on a walk. I often listen to a book while I'm walking my dog and while I'm driving. So yeah,
that's awesome. Ryan, it has been such a pleasure. This is our first conversation ever. This went well. Dude, I'm looking forward to the next time that this happens.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Lee.
It was such a pleasure. And if anyone wants to get the book, where do they go?
So the easiest thing to remember is the name of the book is Dear Coffee Buyer. And if you go to dearcoffeebuyer.com, it will redirect you to Scott Rao's website for where that book is. You can also find Dear Coffee Buyer on Amazon. Amazon.com is a website that sells a bunch of stuff, including books.
We're going to get on fabulously.
It's something like everything from A to Z, something like that.
I've never really been someone who shops online, and then I moved here and have become a little bit like, I don't even know why I would bother going to a mall ever again. It just sounds disgusting now that Amazon is in my life. Yeah,
easily.
I don't know what I'm going to do when I go to Australia for a month. It's like, oh, fuck, I've got to actually go to shops again.
Do you though?
Well, they've got Amazon over there now, but it's not really working to full speed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so Amazon, it came out this year in Australia, so they're still ironing out. They still only deliver to certain places. It still takes 2 weeks to get to you. None of this.
Wait, no way.
It takes forever. Yeah, we have a terrible system in Australia with regards to postage. So they're using, they're still establishing all the infrastructure.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
It's not 2 weeks, but it's still a long time. It's not the same as like you order it in the morning and it's here 2 hours later.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. All right. That's too bad.
Thank you, sir. We'll talk again soon, I hope. Thank you again for the book. It was awesome.
Yeah. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Bye.
Bye.